Hello, I'm George Stretfield, High Sheriff for Dorset 2020. My role is to represent the Queen's interests in the county, and in particular matters of criminal justice and the welfare of those who work within it, and to maintain the Queen's peace and the safety and security of her citizens. Traditionally, I would have held my legal service at this time of year to celebrate the maintenance of law in our county and to thank those that work tirelessly to uphold and deliver it. Sadly, COVID-19 is responsible for its cancellation. In its place, I'd like to introduce a short film which seeks to explain the significance, value, and importance of our criminal justice system to society at large, to highlight the role of the volunteers that are integral to it, and to thank all those involved in maintaining the Queen's peace. The filming took place in Dorchester's Shire Hall, Dorset's central courtroom from which the Tolpuddle martyrs were sentenced to deportation in the 19th century. It features 4 people who will each look at the criminal justice system from very different angles. Mrs. Justice May is the senior circuit judge on the Western Circuit, from Winchester to Land's End. She will highlight the role and importance of volunteers within our criminal justice system. Our Chief Constable, James Vaughan, will demonstrate that policing by consent is critical and central to maintaining law and order and results in a harmonious society. Canon Janet Smith is my chaplain, a role which is as old as the High Sheriff's. In this year, when mental health is so much in the news, Janet will discuss why the spiritual aspect of our lives is so vital for the community's health. And finally, Lord Neuberger, past President of the Supreme Court, will take a more strategic and wider view of our criminal justice system to understand the place it plays in our society and the freedoms we all enjoy to go about our business without fear or favour. Mrs. Justice May travels our region talking to judges, magistrates, lawyers and court staff. She meets the whole range of volunteers that are embedded within our legal framework system. She will highlight their values and importance to our criminal justice and explain why they are an essential part of the English legal structure and central to the successful delivery of justice in this country.
Here we are in the Old Court in Dorchester, where Judge Jeffreys and others formerly administered justice, often very harsh, to the folk of the county at the assizes. It was here in the early 19th century that 6 local men were arrested, tried, convicted and then deported to Australia on manufactured charges brought to stop them and to deter others from joining a friendly society, forerunner of the trades unions. These 6 men, 2 of them brothers, 2 more, a father and son, became known as the Tolpuddle martyrs. This year marks the 175th anniversary of their trial. It generated huge press interest at the time. 250,000 people signed a petition, and 30,000 marched down Whitehall calling for the men to be pardoned and the sentence overturned. Thanks to the efforts of those volunteers, justice was done, and the men were given free passage home. What are volunteers in the criminal justice system today? There are so many ways in which volunteers support and enrich the criminal justice system. The most obvious example is that of magistrates. There are more than 30,000 lay magistrates who between them hear and determine over 95% of all criminal cases in England and Wales. But there are other equally vital roles performed by volunteers at every stage of the criminal justice process. Like many other volunteers, they take time away from their regular jobs to assist and strengthen the police effort in their area. Volunteer members of the public act as appropriate adults at police stations, providing independent support and critical observation during police interviews with young and vulnerable persons suspected of committing a crime. Some of you may have seen the TV docudrama about the person called in to act as an appropriate adult when Fred West was arrested in Gloucester in the mid-1990s. At each Crown Court, there are volunteers from the Citizens Advice Witness Service. These people provide vital support to witnesses, their friends and family when they come to court. Those of you who have ever stood in a witness box in court will know that answering questions, often difficult ones, on your own, with a courtroom of people looking at you, is a highly stressful process. Witness support volunteers can often make a real difference to the ability of a vulnerable witness to give their account of what happened. Without such evidence, a dangerous defendant could be wrongly acquitted and go free. The opposite is also true, since these volunteers also work with defence witnesses. Without their evidence, an innocent defendant may be convicted. Victim support volunteers provide assistance to victims of crime, whether or not an offender has been identified, apprehended, and tried. An example is the critical support given to victims of sex crimes, where specific volunteers will befriend and support someone from soon after the assault through reporting and interview, then on through the months of waiting and throughout any trial and sentence. Without such consistent support and encouragement, many victims would give up during a significantly grueling time for them. At the other end of the process, there are a multitude of charities and voluntary services providing rehabilitative and other programs inside prison and out. They also contribute significantly to the well-being of prisoners' families. It's the families who are often the unseen and innocent victims of crime. Book at Bedtime is a wonderful initiative where prisoners record a bedtime story for their children, who can then hear their absent father or mother reading to them before they go to sleep. Finally, although there are many volunteers whom I have missed, I should mention boards of visitors to prisons, whose volunteer members oversee the work of their local institutions, establishing local accountability and seeing that prisoners and staff live and work in decent conditions. None of these volunteers is a substitute for paid staff working within the police, courts, and prisons, nor are they intended to be. Volunteering in the ways to which I've referred is not at all about achieving justice on the cheap. All of these volunteers provide a valuable connection with the public at large, in a disinterested way, and are seen to do so because they're not paid. That's the point. I want to turn lastly to the role of the High Sheriff, another important volunteer within the criminal justice system. Today's High Sheriffs are thus important public figures with ancient roots upholding and promoting peace, justice, and good works in their county or city. Resident, local, and visiting judges greatly value their continuing links with the High Sheriffs and the introduction they give to the local community. In these ways, High Sheriffs exemplify the value of volunteers within the system. Together with others, they ground and embed the vital thread by which the rule of law stitches together community cohesion and ensures security, through the continued values of tolerance, kindness, generosity, justice, and peace.
Under Chief Constable James Vaughan's leadership, Her Majesty's Inspectorate has praised Dorset Police for the way they treat the public fairly, and officers are credited with making fair and ethical decisions. The Chief Constable will discuss how policing by consent, which is an essential part of their ethos, is integral to maintaining law and order within a free society.
Policing was founded nearly 200 years ago by the then Home Secretary, Sir Robert Peel. He set out 9 key principles to build an ethical policing model, initially in London, but later it was rolled out to the county shires. One of the most important of those principles is that policing is something that is done with the consent of the public that it's set to serve. He said, the police are the public and the public are the police. So the value of a policing model that is based upon the consent of the general public was illustrated and is being illustrated as we grapple with the terrible effects of the global pandemic, the coronavirus. Government have stepped forward and placed restrictions on our freedom, restrictions that we haven't seen perhaps since the Second World War. And the police were asked to step forward and enforce those restrictions. And it's very important for me as the Chief Constable of Dorset to ensure that that was done in a proportionate way. We used what we call the 4 E's. We wanted to educate people. We wanted to explain to people. We wanted to encourage people to comply. And only as a last resource would we use enforcement. And that was the model we used. So we sought the consent of the public for us to police them in that way. And what we saw was that actually, when people are treated with respect and maturity, they act responsibly. With just a few exceptions, a few hundred people out of a population of coming on for 1 million, we had very, very high compliance. And I think that's because we have a relationship with the public, which is one of mutual trust and confidence. When the police act proportionately with the consent of the public, then the public act accordingly. So the consent model, the British policing model, where routinely unarmed men and women who are just civilians that are asked to step forward and swear the Queen's oath, with the support, cooperation and consent of the public, is one that has built trust and confidence at levels in England and Wales greater than anywhere else in the world. I'm really proud and delighted to say that in Dorset we have one of the highest levels of trust and confidence in the force that's seen anywhere in the country. And that's something that I seek to maintain and improve over time. The policing by consent model is something that respects the freedoms and liberties that we enjoy in the country. And it's where the public give their consent and cooperation for the police to keep them safe and bring offenders to justice. And it's one that we should cherish here in Dorset.
The modern High Sheriff's chaplain acts as his or her mentor and spiritual guide. This year, sadly, mental health problems have become much more apparent as a result of the pandemic. As High Sheriff, I have met and talked to a number of charities dealing with this in many different ways. And I'm starting to understand how stress affects our health and well-being. Janet will show why mental health and the spiritual aspect of our lives is so essential to a harmonious society.
Well, I've been privileged to have lived and worked with people of different faiths, the Jewish faith, the people of Islam and Hindu societies. And I found that all, and indeed it's not true just simply of people of faith, but I think people of no faith, that we all espouse the belief that's summed up in something called the Golden Rule. And that is that we should be treating others as we want to be treated. And if all communities and societies lived this, then society would indeed be harmonious. But the way we treat others will perhaps depend on how we ourselves have been treated and how we feel and know ourselves as individuals. If we've been valued and feel valued and indeed of equal value, and if we have meaning to our life and ways to be and to do that are unique to ourselves, if we're grounded and secure from harm, if we're able to be creative and contribute to society, if we feel forgiven, because none of us, I think, feel we're perfect, and we have a longing to be guiltless and forgiven, if we have hope when life is uncertain and hard, all of these things, all of these feelings, and above all, of course, knowing that we're loved, if we have these and this wholeness of life found in good mental health and a spiritual life, then we're liberated to treat others well. And good mental health and a spiritual life can be transforming. It allows us to contribute to enhancing the lives of others. And that might mean including rather than excluding, being non-judgmental but compassionate, being generous-spirited and not greedy and selfish. When others see they are cared about and cared for and included, then there's a chance of harmonious societies. We need to work toward a foundational hope for and in our societies where we will stand on solid ground and all of us create common good. That we will know our lives are lived in trust and a shared society.
The restrictions on our way of life as a result of the pandemic have made us all challenge our freedoms. We are free to complain when we do not like what the government tells us. It is integral to our society that the press is free to interrogate and challenge what we are told. We can freely protest on major issues of the day, such as climate change, global warming, Brexit, or Black Lives Matter. From his vantage point as our previous most senior lawyer, Lord Neuberger will explain why we should value and appreciate the English criminal justice system, which gives us our free society, so essential to our way of life.
I suppose fundamentally there are two main principles on which a civilized society such as ours is based. The first is democratic government, a government that has democratic legitimacy and democratic accountability. And the second, which is perhaps less thought about, and that I want to talk about briefly now, is the rule of law. If you don't have the rule of law in that sense, people will lose faith in the system. If the government can act arbitrarily without the courts enforcing people's rights, people lose faith in the government. And if criminals are allowed to get away with it, people lose faith again in the government. So we need the rule of law. We need it to protect our freedoms, we need it to protect our rights, and we need it also to control our baser instincts, to control the overmighty, the overrich. And of course, in due course, it also means that we are given rights, but those rights have to reflect not merely our rights to free speech and so on, but other people's rights not to be attacked unfairly and to, for instance, you can't use free speech to incite racial hatred. Protecting people against the government is important at a time when the government has a great deal of power, but it's also important to protect people's rights because if you don't, companies and other people will not invest because it's scarcely worth investing in a country where you don't know that your contracts are going to be enforced properly and fairly by the courts, where you don't know that the government is going to be prevented from arbitrarily swiping your assets. All that's to do with the rule of law. So the rule of law also is important economically, as well as being important in terms of giving the public, giving individuals, giving citizens proper rights and confidence. And confidence in the government, confidence in the system, is very important. Nothing could be more clear than that at the moment, where we are suffering the COVID-19 pandemic. Whatever you think about the government's attitude, whatever you think about the rules the government makes, the government is making these rules in order to ensure that society suffers to a minimum extent. But people have to have confidence in the government, people have to have respect for the government if they are to observe these rules. The rule of law also has a more broad constitutional impact, which perhaps, again, is not so obvious to people in their daily lives, but is actually of great importance. We're ruled essentially by three limbs, three parts of government. We have Parliament, the democratically elected legislature. It makes the laws. Then we have the executive, which is far, far larger than Parliament because it consists of civil service, local authorities, quangos, even the cabinet, which is the peak of the executive, government ministers. They carry out government policy. The executive has to abide by the rules laid down by Parliament. It has to lay down Parliament by what Parliament says. Ultimately, we have a system of parliamentary supremacy. Parliament lays down the laws. But the laws have to be put into effect and interpreted, and that's where the third arm of government comes in, the judiciary, the judges. They decide what the law is and interpret what Parliament has done. And if Parliament doesn't like the way its laws are interpreted by the judges, Parliament can change the law, and it sometimes does. One of the most headlined aspects of the judge's role is to identify the demarcation area, as it were, between the executive, the cabinet and the civil service, and Parliament. And there have been a couple of cases recently, the most famous one of which was to do with prorogation, when the Prime Minister in the autumn of 2019 decided to prorogue Parliament for 6 weeks. The courts were called upon to decide whether that was lawful. That was an important case because it involved the rule of law, but involved the courts deciding where the role of the executive stopped and the role of Parliament started. And in that connection, it caused quite a lot of controversy, but that was the court, whatever you think of the decision, carrying out a fundamental rule of law role, deciding what the executive could do as against Parliament. We've always had rights in this country, and those rights have normally been taken for granted. We have a very unusual system in this country where we don't have a written constitution setting out the rules that apply to the way we're run. Virtually every other country in the world has a written constitution. We have the privilege of having built up a democratic system with rights and liberties over 350 years. We've had no civil war, we've had no successful invasion, we've had no tyranny, and we've been a very privileged country. And as a result of that, we don't have a written constitution. We have a constitution that has been built up by convention and bits and pieces of statute law. If you like, going all the way back to Magna Carta, more than 800 years ago, some of whose rules still are part of our law. But that means that our system is a bit more unclear, a bit more flexible, because we don't have firm rule. And personally, I think it's a very beneficial system, because it's worked for 350 years, which is longer than most countries, the United States, Germany, Italy, have been in existence, and is over a time when many larger countries have been invaded successfully and have had tyranny, like France. And in that sense, this country is very privileged. But the danger is, and this is what I'd like to end with, the danger is, because we've had such a privileged and lucky time, we take the rule of law for granted. And that is not something we should do. Human beings are such that we're imperfect, and there is a risk that the rule of law gets undermined. And once it gets undermined, then we're in real difficulty. We should all be as sure as we can and act as well as we can to make sure that the rule of law is still there in this country with its very proud tradition.
We readily take many things for granted in our lives. With this film, my aim is to make us stop for a moment and consider just what we've heard. I hope it will have shone a light on the people that are our criminal justice system. The judges, the magistrates, court staff, probation staff, witness support, the prison service, police, fire and rescue, border force, local government officers, mayors, councillors, and many more. They are tireless in their passion and their effort to maintain a free and fair legal system. They work to keep us safe within our communities, and both to support victims of crime and to successfully integrate people back into society. And finally, I'd also like to pay tribute to all those that work endlessly to prevent people, especially the most vulnerable in society, from getting drawn into crime in the first place. I have a theory that the vast majority of us have no idea what it takes to ensure that we are free to walk safely down our high streets, our country lanes, and our seafronts. Thank you to all of you that ensure that we have that freedom.